January 1945 was one of the coldest winters Western Europe had endured in decades. The snow in eastern France lay in thick, uneven layers, swallowing boots and muffling sound. To the east, the Rhine River marked the gateway into Germany. The Allies had pushed this far through sheer attrition, but the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had strained every unit to breaking point. Ammunition was rationed, reinforcements were late, and fatigue was visible on every face. Along a ridgeline near the small Alsatian village of Holzwehr, a few dozen men of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division waited in the freezing stillness. Among them was 2nd Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy of B Company, 15th Infantry Regiment. Barely 20 years old, he was already something of a legend among his peers, a boyish-looking Texan whose courage in battle had become quietly known up and down the line. Murphy stood only 5'5", but there was a steadiness in him that drew others. He had fought across North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before coming to France. His men trusted him implicitly. They had seen him do the impossible more than once. Their position at the edge of the Bois de Riedwehr was poorly chosen. Open ground in front, thick forest behind, no natural cover except a frozen ditch. The snow reflected every flash of movement, and the temperature dropped below freezing at night. The soldiers hacked at the earth with shovels, trying to dig foxholes into soil as hard as concrete. Many wore thin gloves, and frostbite was as real a threat as enemy fire. When they ate, their rations cracked with ice. When they spoke, their breath hung like smoke. Murphy's orders were plain but brutal. Hold this ground until reinforcements arrived. It sounded simple enough on paper, but the maps didn't show the human cost. The company had started the month with 120 men. Now it had fewer than 40 effectives, many of them replacements who had never seen real combat. The division's supply lines were stretched, and the men had not received proper winter gear. The engines of their supporting tank destroyers were left idling, not from fear, but to keep fuel from freezing. Across the line, the Germans were regrouping. Patrols reported armored tracks in the forest and radio chatter from units of the 2nd Panzer Division, battle-hardened veterans retreating from the Ardennes who were not done fighting. Intelligence suggested they were massing for one final attempt to break through to the Rhine. Holzwehr, an otherwise unremarkable village, happened to sit in their path. Murphy sensed it before anyone else. He had a habit of pacing the perimeter, checking on his men personally. He stopped by each foxhole, exchanging a few words or adjusting a rifle placement. When one soldier asked if reinforcements were really coming, Murphy replied, "If they are, they'll be glad we're still here." It wasn't bravado. It was his way of grounding fear in something practical. At dawn on January 26th, the first rumblings came through the mist. Dull, rhythmic, like thunder buried beneath snow. The veterans knew the sound. It was artillery, and it was getting closer. A few minutes later, the first shells burst in the trees behind them, showering the frozen ground with splinters and shards of steel. Snow and dirt mixed into choking clouds. The men ducked deeper into their holes, gripping rifles with numb fingers. The barrage went on for nearly 20 minutes, methodical and precise, softening the ground for what was coming next. Then came the tanks. Through the haze, their shapes appeared, dark, squat silhouettes moving in formation. Infantry followed, shadows darting between trunks, rifles slung, advancing in wide arcs. The enemy was disciplined and confident. They expected this thin American line to crumble on contact. Murphy scanned the ridge with binoculars, counting at least 6 armored vehicles. His mind worked faster than the fear that pressed on him. He knew the company couldn't hold against armor in open terrain, not without artillery support, and their radios were unreliable. The snowstorm had blocked air support as well. For now, all they could do was hold position, fight with what they had, and buy time. "Get ready," he said quietly into his field phone. "They'll come straight up the middle." He moved down the line, checking the tank destroyers. The men inside were nervous, smoke already curling from their exhausts. "Save your rounds," Murphy told them. "Make them count." When the tanks opened fire, the ridge erupted. Shells ripped through the trees, splintering trunks and throwing earth in great sprays. German infantry followed behind, using the armor for cover. B Company answered with rifles, Browning machine guns, and what few bazookas they had left. The sound was deafening, gunfire echoing off frozen hillsides, punctuated by the shriek of mortars. Murphy's voice cut through the chaos. He moved between foxholes, shouting orders, keeping men focused. "Short bursts, aim low," he reminded them, conserving ammunition. A tank destroyer to the left fired, hitting one of the lead German vehicles square in the turret. The explosion lit up the snow like lightning. Cheers went up, short and sharp, before more shells landed and forced everyone flat again. For hours the fight was a blur of smoke and noise. Men slipped on ice as they ran ammunition, dragging wounded back through the trees. Murphy refused to stay under cover. He climbed onto the exposed ridge to direct fire, signaling to the gunners with hand gestures when the radio failed. Shrapnel tore his overcoat, but he didn't slow down. His calm steadied everyone around him. By late morning, the attack had paused. The Germans pulled back behind the tree line to regroup. The Americans took stock. 1 tank destroyer hit, several men dead, many wounded. Their ammunition was dangerously low, yet the line still held. Murphy knew it wouldn't last. Through the smoke he could see movement again, new waves forming, armor adjusting its position. The real attack was still to come. He walked to the center of the ridge, snow crunching beneath his boots, and spoke to the men near him. "They'll hit hard," he said, as if stating the weather. "Let them come." The soldiers nodded, some silently checking their rifles, others simply staring ahead. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, but no one spoke of retreat. The order was clear, and so was their commander's intent. As the next volley of shells began to fall, Audie Murphy looked down the slope where the white fields disappeared into haze. To any observer, he seemed impossibly calm, a small figure standing amid thunder. The battle for Holzweier had begun, and at its center stood a man who did not intend to move, no matter what came out of the fog. At precisely 10 a.m., the mist that had hung over the Alsatian ridge began to thin, revealing the enemy that the Americans had been expecting all morning. Through the drifting smoke, the outlines of German armor appeared, broad, hulking machines crawling forward with mechanical certainty. The sound came first, a low grinding growl that vibrated through the frozen ground and into the bones of every man on the line. Then came the infantry, spread out in disciplined ranks, their field gray coats blending almost perfectly into the snow and trees. For the men of B Company, it felt as if the entire forest was moving toward them. Murphy crouched behind the turret of a tank destroyer, binoculars pressed to his face. He could see at least 6 tanks in the lead, likely Panzer IVs, with another line of troops advancing behind them. He lowered the glasses and spoke evenly into his radio, reporting the movement. Static answered him. The radio operator tried again, adjusting the frequency, but nothing came through. The artillery batteries behind them were out of contact. For the next few hours, they would be alone. "Steady!" Murphy called, his voice cut through the bitter wind. "Hold your fire till they're close." He knew ammunition was scarce and that early shooting would only give away their positions. The men nodded, checking their rifles, bazookas, and machine guns. Steam rose from their mouths as they waited. The cold had become a living thing. It numbed their fingers, slowed their reflexes, and made every movement feel heavier. When the first American machine gun finally opened up, the spell broke. Tracer rounds sliced through the fog, bright red lines against the white horizon. The Germans answered immediately with mortars and tank shells. A direct hit on the left flank sent a column of black smoke twisting into the sky. One of the tank destroyers, a lumbering M10, had taken a shell through its side armor. Flames leapt out of the turret, and the crew scrambled clear, one man rolling in the snow to extinguish his burning jacket. Murphy sprinted toward the wreckage, shouting for the men to fall back into the woods. His voice was hoarse, nearly drowned by the explosions. The ground trembled with each impact, shaking snow loose from the trees. He could see that the German infantry was closing the distance fast, fanning out in a pincer formation. If they broke through here, the entire battalion's right flank would collapse. "Pull back! Get into the tree line!" he ordered. Most of the surviving men obeyed, dragging the wounded with them. But Murphy did not follow. Instead, he turned back toward the burning M10. The tank destroyer was engulfed now, its 3-inch gun pointing uselessly skyward. Ammunition inside the hull was beginning to cook off, popping like distant firecrackers. To anyone watching, the vehicle looked ready to explode. Murphy climbed onto it. It was madness, but to him it was the only logical move left. The .50 caliber Browning machine gun mounted on the turret was still intact and loaded. He swung it toward the approaching infantry and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared to life, each burst echoing across the snow. German soldiers dropped where they stood, caught in the open. The recoil jolted through his arms and shoulders, but he kept firing, short, controlled bursts, just as he had trained to do. From the woods behind him, his men turned to watch. Through the thick haze and falling snow, they could see a single figure standing on the flaming wreck, silhouetted against the inferno. Bullets sparked off the steel around him. Smoke curled around his helmet. Still, he did not duck. He adjusted the gun and fired again, raking the advancing line. Later, one private said, "It looked like he was part of the machine, like he'd fused with it." The Germans responded with everything they had. Tank gunners turned their turrets toward the burning wreck, loosing shells that screamed over Murphy's head and detonated nearby. Mortar rounds fell closer and closer. One fragment tore into his leg, slicing through his trousers. He wrapped it with a field dressing and kept going. His boots slipped on the steel deck slicked with oil and snow, but he never stopped firing. At one point, German infantry tried to flank him, crawling through the ditches along the road. Murphy saw them through the smoke and shifted his aim. The Browning's heavy rounds tore through the snowbanks, cutting down the attackers in seconds. The few who survived threw themselves flat, unwilling to move. The tanks hesitated, uncertain whether they were facing a full American position or just one madman. For nearly an hour, Murphy held that ridge alone. Every time his men tried to return and help, he waved them back. "Stay where you are," he shouted into the radio. "Hold your position." His voice was calm but absolute. He was buying them time. Time for artillery to re-establish contact. Time for reinforcements to find them. Above him, the sky was dark with smoke and shrapnel. Finally, one of the tanks advanced again, its turret rotating toward the burning M10. Murphy switched targets and opened fire directly into the driver's viewport. The tank shuddered, stopped, then began to reverse. Its infantry escort fell back into the tree line. The assault had stalled. He seized the chance to call in coordinates for artillery. The radio crackled to life, faint but enough. Using the wreckage for cover, Murphy adjusted the field phone under his chin and shouted the coordinates for the advancing German positions. Minutes later, the first American shells began to land, striking deep among the attackers. The ground erupted in flashes of orange and white. Now the Germans were caught between Murphy's gunfire and the incoming barrage. Panic spread. Some tried to drag their wounded back, others simply ran. Murphy kept firing until the Browning overheated and jammed. Smoke poured from the barrel. The last belt of ammunition hung loose in his hand. When the shooting finally stopped, silence returned, eerie and absolute. The battlefield smelled of oil, blood, and cordite. Murphy climbed down from the wreck, his face blackened with soot. His right leg throbbed where the shrapnel had torn it, but he barely felt it through the cold. Behind him, the remnants of B Company emerged from the woods. They had expected to find their lieutenant dead. Instead, they found him standing among the wreckage, the enemy in full retreat. "He wasn't human," one soldier muttered later. "He was fireproof that day." Murphy limped back to the line, refusing medical attention. He checked the survivors, spoke quietly to the radio operator, then simply said, "Get the men ready. They'll be back." His uniform was torn, his face streaked with sweat and grime, but his voice carried the same calm authority it always had. What he didn't know was how much his stand had cost the enemy. Later estimates concluded that his fire had killed or wounded over 50 German soldiers and destroyed several vehicles. More importantly, he had stalled an entire regiment long enough for reinforcements to move into position. The German officers, convinced they were facing multiple American strongpoints, called off the attack. In that hour, one young man from Texas had done what artillery, armor, and air support could not. He had stopped an advance by sheer willpower and precision. When asked later what drove him to stand on that burning machine and fight alone, Murphy's answer was simple. They were coming too fast. Somebody had to slow them down. As the smoke drifted away and the snow began to fall again, the ridge fell quiet. A silence born not of peace, but of exhaustion. Around him, the dead lay half buried in drifts, their rifles frozen in their hands. The burned-out tank destroyer still smoldered behind him, its gun barrel pointing skyward like a monument. Murphy stood for a long moment, staring out at the empty field where the enemy had vanished. The wind bit through his torn uniform, but he barely noticed. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but the line had held. And for now, that was enough. When the last echoes of gunfire faded, an unnatural quiet settled over the ridge. The air still smelled of fuel and scorched metal. The snow was no longer white. It was streaked with soot and blood, trampled into a red-gray paste beneath spent cartridges. The silence did not mean peace. It meant exhaustion. For a few moments, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the frozen hills themselves were stunned by what had just happened. Audie Murphy climbed down from the smoking wreckage of the tank destroyer, his right leg stiff and bleeding. The fire crackled behind him, sending waves of heat against his back as he limped through the debris. Every muscle in his body ached, and his hearing was dulled by the concussion of hours of explosions. Yet his movements were steady, deliberate. He had been in combat long enough to know that the quiet after battle was often the most dangerous time of all. Around him, the surviving soldiers of B Company began to emerge from their foxholes. 20 men where there had once been 40. They stared at him as if seeing a ghost. Many had assumed he had been killed in the inferno, swallowed by the tank's explosion. Instead, he was walking toward them, blackened by smoke, his uniform torn to shreds, steam rising from his helmet in the cold. "You're still here," one private murmured, disbelief in his voice. Murphy didn't answer. He just nodded and said, "Let's get back to work." He refused evacuation, though medics insisted. The wound on his leg had frozen into a crusted band of blood and ice, but he wouldn't let them touch it. There was still work to do. The ridge was technically theirs, but control meant little if the line fell apart. The enemy had withdrawn into the forest, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped. Murphy gathered his men and began to rebuild the defense, what was left of it. The landscape looked like the surface of another world. Trees were snapped in half, their trunks blackened by explosions. Craters pocked the ground, filled with half-melted snow. The wrecked M10 still burned, its gun barrel pointing toward the sky like a monument. Beyond it, the field was scattered with German bodies half buried in drifts. The survivors from B Company moved carefully among them, collecting weapons, checking for movement, anything that might be used again. Every bullet counted now. Murphy organized the remnants into pairs, assigning sectors of fire. They had no heavy weapons left, only rifles, carbines, and a few boxes of ammunition. He ordered the men to dig in again, reinforcing the foxholes with debris and logs. The ground was hard as stone, but they chipped away anyway. There was something mechanical, almost ritualistic, in the way they worked. The labor steadied their hands and silenced the fear that lingered after the adrenaline wore off. When one of the new replacements began to shake uncontrollably, his rifle rattling in his hands, Murphy crouched beside him. "You did fine," he said quietly. "They'll come again, and we'll be ready." His voice carried no anger, only certainty. To those men, cold, hungry, and terrified, his composure was more powerful than any speech. He moved from position to position, checking weapons, adjusting fields of fire, repeating the same calm words. "We're not going anywhere. This is where we stand." The snow began to fall again in heavy flakes, softening the outlines of the dead and covering the burnt wreckage with a deceptive calm. The men huddled in their holes, rifles resting across their knees, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Hours passed. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the wounded stayed quiet, their pain dulled by exhaustion and cold. By early afternoon, a few scouts crept forward to assess the damage. They reported that the Germans had pulled back completely, at least for now. The enemy must have believed they were facing an entire company, not a handful of survivors. Smoke from the earlier fight still hung low, obscuring visibility, but the sounds of retreat, engines, shouted orders in German, drifted faintly through the forest. Murphy listened, then simply nodded. "They're regrouping," he said. "We hold until dark." When reinforcements finally arrived from the 30th Infantry Regiment late in the day, the sight that greeted them was surreal. The ridge looked like a graveyard. The snow was scorched in wide arcs, littered with shattered helmets and weapons. Murphy's men stood among it, faces pale, uniforms caked with soot. Their commander was at the center, leaning on his carbine, giving quiet instructions to the newcomers about where to set up their lines. The reinforcements began counting the bodies. More than 50 German soldiers lay dead across the field, along with several destroyed vehicles. The charred wreck of the tank destroyer marked the center of the engagement, its hull pitted with bullet scars. The medics tended to the wounded, starting with those who had collapsed during the digging. Murphy directed them without ever sitting down. Only when every casualty from his company had been evacuated did he allow himself to rest. He sat on an ammunition crate near the edge of the ridge, helmet off, head bowed. For the first time since the morning, he stopped moving. His hands trembled from cold and exhaustion, the knuckles raw from the gun's recoil. The medics approached again, but he waved them off. "I'll manage," he said. His voice was barely audible. One of the newcomers handed him a canteen. He took a sip and handed it back. Then, after a long silence, he muttered, "We did what we came to do." That night, the snow continued to fall, burying the evidence of the day's slaughter. The men of B Company took turns on watch, scanning the black horizon through half-frozen binoculars. There was no moon, only the faint red glow of distant fires. Somewhere beyond the forest, the Germans were regrouping, but they did not return. They had learned what it meant to face a position that refused to yield. Inside one of the foxholes, two privates whispered about what they had seen. The lieutenant standing on the burning tank, firing until the gun went silent. "He's not human," one said quietly. "He's made of steel." The other shook his head. "No," he said. He's just the last man who wouldn't run. At dawn, a patrol found tracks in the snow leading away from the ridge, signs of the enemy's withdrawal. The field around them was still dotted with the dead. The Americans began collecting the bodies, covering them with tarps until graves registration teams could arrive. Murphy helped with the work, moving slowly, his limp more pronounced now. He said little. The men who tried to thank him for saving their lives got the same answer. We all did our part. Later that day, a report was sent to battalion headquarters. It listed the engagement as a successful defensive position. Casualties, 12 killed, 2 missing, several wounded. Enemy losses, estimated 50 or more. The brief description barely hinted at the scale of what had happened. One man standing alone against a regiment, buying enough time for an entire line to survive. When night came again, the ridge was quiet. The fires were out, the wrecks covered in frost. The men of B Company huddled in their rebuilt foxholes, listening to the distant rumble of artillery somewhere far to the north. Murphy sat apart, staring out across the snow. He knew the fight was far from over. The war would go on, and so would he. But for now, in that frozen silence, he allowed himself a single thought. The line had held. In the weeks and years to come, soldiers would speak of that ridge in hushed tones. They would remember the image burned into their minds. A small figure alone on a burning machine. The gun hammering against the snowstorm, holding back an army. To the Germans who survived, he was the madman of Holzwehr. To his men, he was something simpler, the lieutenant who stayed when everyone else was told to go. That night, as the cold deepened and the snow buried the last traces of battle, the ridge became still again, silent, scarred, and remembered. It would remain that way for decades, a frozen monument to the men who refused to move, and to one soldier from Texas who turned the tide of a war from the top of a burning tank. When the wind shifted and the snow began to thaw, the battlefield at Holzwehr re-emerged from beneath the frost like a corpse surfacing from water. The white hills that had once looked clean and untouched were now streaked with black soot and brown mud. The air smelled of oil, iron, and decay. The burned-out hull of the tank destroyer still smoldered, a dull orange glow flickering through its ruptured armor. Around it, melted snow pooled into gray puddles, reflecting the twisted wreckage of weapons and helmets. It was a scene both ordinary and unspeakable, one of countless battlefields that winter, but for those who had been there, it was unforgettable. Engineers arrived first, sent to clear mines and salvage equipment. They walked among the debris without realizing they were treading on ground that had nearly cost the regiment its flank. The charred tank was logged as vehicle destroyed in action and marked for recovery. Medics followed, working among the wrecks, pulling bodies from shallow snowdrifts. The heat of the previous day's explosions had fused some of the frozen earth into glass-like crusts, making the work harder. They said little. The men of the 3rd Infantry Division who marched past in those days knew only that something terrible had happened here. They could smell it, even if no one spoke of it. Murphy, meanwhile, lay in a field hospital not far from the line. His wounds were minor compared to others, shrapnel to the leg, burns to his hands, but exhaustion had nearly finished him. The doctors tried to hold him for a week, but he was restless. He spent most of his time sitting up in bed, staring at the canvas ceiling, thinking about the men who hadn't made it back. When reporters arrived to photograph the Texan lieutenant who held the line, he turned them away. "Talk to the boys who were with me," he said quietly. "They did the hard part." To Murphy, the fight at Holzwehr wasn't heroism, it was necessity. His company had been cornered, and he had done what needed to be done. He spoke little of the burning tank destroyer, dismissing questions with a shrug. "There wasn't anywhere else to go," he said. "You just stay put till it's over." But his commander, Captain Keith Ware, saw it differently. The after-action report, filed within days, described his conduct as an act of conspicuous gallantry far beyond the call of duty. Witness statements poured in from every surviving soldier in B Company. Each man gave the same account, how Murphy had stood alone on the wrecked vehicle, firing the machine gun while shells burst around him, refusing to retreat until the last round was spent. Some swore they saw him still firing as flames climbed higher than the treetops. The regimental intelligence officer compiled their testimonies into a report that filled several pages. The conclusion was unambiguous. Without Murphy's stand, the battalion's flank would have collapsed, and hundreds more might have died. The paperwork for a Medal of Honor recommendation began almost immediately, moving from regimental headquarters to division command and from there to 7th Army headquarters in Strasbourg. The process was bureaucratic, but in this case unusually fast. Even officers hardened by years of war paused when they read the details. Single-handedly delayed a German counterattack of regiment strength, one summary stated. Remained in position despite wounds and direct fire, killing or wounding over 50 enemy troops. Murphy was uncomfortable with the attention. He told anyone who asked that medals didn't make sense in war. War isn't medals, he said to a fellow officer who congratulated him. It's trying to bring your people home. He refused to attend the ceremony that division headquarters initially planned, insisting he needed to get back to his men. When the surgeon reminded him that he was still technically unfit for duty, Murphy just smiled faintly and said, "They're short-handed. They need me more than I need rest." By the first week of February, he had returned to his unit, walking with a slight limp. The men of B Company greeted him with disbelief. Rumors had already spread through the regiment, stories growing with each retelling. Some said he had destroyed multiple tanks alone. Others claimed he had fought for hours without stopping. The truth, as usual, was simpler and harder. He had stayed because no one else could. And now he was back, asking how many replacements had arrived and what supplies they had left. The war, indifferent to legends, rolled on. Holzweiler faded from the maps as new battles claimed attention. Colmar, Rhineland, the crossing into Germany. Yet among the German units retreating east, the name of the American lieutenant at the burning tank became a warning passed through whispers. Prisoners captured in February spoke of a fanatic Texan whose stand had caused panic among infantry who thought they were facing an entire American regiment. Some German officers used the story as an example of what they called Yankee madness, an enemy who would rather die than yield ground. The psychological effect was real. Allied intelligence later noted an uptick in intercepted German messages describing American defensive positions as strongly held, even when they were not. "They think we're all like that one GI said with a grim grin when told of the reports. "Maybe that's a good thing." For Murphy, it was just another assignment completed. When his commander congratulated him again and mentioned the Medal of Honor paperwork moving up the chain, he dismissed it. "That's above my pay grade," he said. His real focus was on rebuilding his company, training replacements, checking supplies, and maintaining morale. He had learned long ago that survival depended on discipline, not drama. "You don't think about courage," he told a young sergeant one evening. "You think about what has to be done, one thing at a time." As winter turned to spring, the front shifted eastward. The ridge at Holzweiler, once a frozen death trap, became just another patch of French countryside. Villagers returned cautiously, repairing their roofs and burying their dead. The wrecked tank destroyer was towed away for scrap, its steel melted down in peacetime years later. No marker was ever placed there, not at first. But among the men of the 3rd Division, it didn't need one. They carried the memory themselves. To them, Murphy was no longer just a lieutenant. He was a symbol of what they were fighting for, not victory, but endurance. They began referring to him half-jokingly as the man who wouldn't fall back. In motor pools and canteens across France, the story took on a life of its own. Some told it straight, others exaggerated it into legend. But every version carried the same truth. One man had stood against an army and refused to give ground. Murphy never corrected them. When asked how it felt to face so many alone, he would change the subject. "It wasn't alone," he would say quietly. "They were all there with me. You just couldn't see them through the smoke." It was his way of honoring the men who hadn't made it home, the ones whose names didn't appear in reports or ceremonies. In the end, the ridge became another nameless battlefield, reclaimed by weather and time. Grass grew over the craters, and by the summer of 1945, wildflowers bloomed where bodies had once lain. But among those who fought there, the image never faded. A young Texan standing atop a burning machine, smoke rising around him, holding the line when all else had failed. The war was still far from over, but for the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, Holtzwihr had already entered legend. And somewhere in a muddy tent on the edge of another French village, the paperwork for one Medal of Honor, typed in black ink and stamped urgent, continued its quiet journey toward Washington, D.C., carrying the story of a man who never intended to be a hero and yet became one all the same. On the morning of June 2, 1945, in the recently liberated city of Salzburg, the war in Europe was technically over, but the world was still raw with its aftermath. The air carried the strange stillness that follows long violence, silence mixed with the faint clatter of rebuilding. In the courtyard of a former Austrian barracks, soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army gathered for a ceremony. Their uniforms were pressed, but their boots were stained with mud from the roads that had led them here. They had come to witness a rare event, the awarding of the Medal of Honor to a man most of them knew only by reputation, Lieutenant Audie L. Murphy, a 20-year-old Texan whose stand at Holtzwihr had already become legend. Murphy stood at attention before General Alexander Patch, his face expressionless. The citation was read slowly, each line echoing across the square. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The details followed. His single-handed defense against German forces, his refusal to withdraw despite being wounded, his command of artillery fire while exposed to direct enemy assault. The officers around him listened with solemn respect. For them, it was the embodiment of what the Army wanted its men to be, disciplined, fearless, and unyielding under pressure. But Murphy himself didn't see it that way. As the general placed the medal around his neck, the young lieutenant's thoughts were far from Salzburg. He was remembering the ridge at Holtzwihr, the cold, the burning tank, the smell of gunpowder and snow. He saw again the faces of the men who hadn't made it back, the ones who had dug in beside him and never stood up again. When the applause came, he barely heard it. He nodded politely, saluted, and stepped back into line. That night in his diary he wrote, "It doesn't feel like something to celebrate. Too many didn't come back." In the weeks that followed, Murphy's name began appearing in newspapers back home. "Texas boy wins nation's highest honor," one headline read. Photographers posed him with his medal, and reporters asked him what it felt like to be a hero. He answered with practiced modesty, "I was scared, but fear doesn't mean stop." The country wanted symbols of victory, clean, simple stories to make sense of a brutal war, and Murphy became one of them. But those who knew him understood that the fame sat uneasily on his shoulders. When he returned to the United States later that summer, parades awaited him in Dallas and San Antonio. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags, cheering as he passed by in an open-top car. He smiled for them, but the expression never reached his eyes. He had spent years in places where noise meant danger, where applause was replaced by artillery. The cheers of civilians felt alien. He endured them politely, but afterward, he told a friend, they're clapping for something they don't understand. To the men who had served with him, he was still just Murph. They remembered him not as a symbol, but as the quiet lieutenant who checked on every foxhole, who spoke softly even in chaos, who never asked anyone to do what he wouldn't do himself. When they read about his Medal of Honor in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, they were proud but not surprised. "He earned it the hard way," one sergeant wrote home, by not dying when everyone else would have. As the Army documented his record, the scale of his service became clearer. He had received every major U.S. combat award for valor: the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and multiple Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. No other American soldier of his generation would be so decorated. Yet Murphy refused to talk about medals. When a young lieutenant once asked to see them, he shrugged and said, "They're just metal. The ones that matter are the names we can't pin on anything." Still, the memory of Holtzwehr clung to him like smoke. In quiet moments, he would recall the sound of the .50 caliber gun, the mechanical rhythm of it, and the strange calm that had come over him while firing it. "You don't think," he once said, "you just do what you have to." He never spoke of the fear, though it lingered. The war had taught him that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to yield to it. He would repeat that idea for the rest of his life. Fear doesn't mean stop. Historians later analyzed the battle in detail, placing his stand within the broader context of the Colmar Pocket Campaign. They noted that Murphy's defense had not only saved his company, but prevented a larger German counterattack from breaking through the Allied line. It was, in tactical terms, a turning point, the kind of small, localized victory that rarely makes headlines but changes the shape of a front. Yet what caught their attention most was not the strategic result, but the psychological one. His actions at Holtzwehr challenged conventional ideas of what one man could do under modern firepower. Military theorists would later cite him as an example of force concentration at the individual level, a single soldier whose discipline and training multiplied his effectiveness far beyond expectation. For the German officers who survived that day, it was even simpler. In their post-war interrogations, several described the event with a kind of dark awe. One captain referred to Murphy as the American who would not die. Another called his stand a display of madness and precision combined. Among Allied troops, the story spread as legend. Soldiers who had never met him spoke of the kid from Texas who stood alone on a burning tank and stopped an army. To many, he represented something larger than heroism, the stubborn endurance that had carried the Allies through years of defeat and bloodshed. His Medal of Honor became not just a decoration, but a symbol of the will to hold the line when everything else failed. Yet Murphy never allowed the myth to take root in his own mind. When asked about Holtzwehr years later, he said only, "I didn't hold the line held me." That simple reversal revealed what the official citations could not, that for him the fight had never been about glory, but about survival and responsibility. Every soldier knew the feeling, the sense that the only thing keeping you alive was duty itself. Back in Texas, when his family finally saw him again, they found him quieter than before. The boy who had left home at 16 to join the army had returned as a man burdened by ghosts. His youngest sister remembered that he spent long hours sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon, saying little. The war had ended, but in his mind it was not over. He carried it with him everywhere, the sounds, the smells, the faces. In later years, as he gradually entered public life and even Hollywood, the legend would grow. People would call him the most decorated soldier in American history, the fearless Texan who defied the odds. But beneath the accolades remained the truth that he had always known, that courage was not a banner but a weight. The Medal of Honor, though shining on his chest, was heavy in ways no one could see. For the world, it was proof that one man could hold back an army. For Murphy, it was a reminder of the men who hadn't. He kept the medal locked away, rarely taking it out. "It belongs to them," he once said, meaning the soldiers who had fallen on that frozen ridge. And in a way, it did. As Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins, the story of Holtzwehr became one more fragment of a vast war, a testament to endurance in a time when the world seemed to have run out of it. But for those who had stood near that ridge, and for the man from Texas who refused to fall back, it remained something deeper. It was not about victory, nor even about survival. It was about a truth as cold and immovable as the snow that had once covered that battlefield. That when everything else collapses, courage is not found in the absence of fear, but in the refusal to yield to it. And on that winter morning in France, one soldier had shown the world what that looked like. When the war finally ended, the guns fell silent, but for Audie Murphy, silence brought no peace. He returned home to Texas in the summer of 1945, a national hero, though he never called himself one. The Army had discharged him with honors, and newspapers hailed his name across the country. Yet when the cheering stopped, he found himself adrift in a world that no longer spoke his language. The routines of civilian life, quiet mornings, polite conversations, familiar streets, felt foreign after years of battlefields and command decisions. "It's strange," he told a reporter not long after returning home. "The war is over, but it doesn't feel finished inside you." Murphy tried to disappear into normalcy. He moved back in with family near Farmersville, spent time hunting, riding horses, and visiting the small towns that had watched him grow up. But everywhere he went, people wanted to shake his hand, take his picture, or hear him retell the stories he wanted most to forget. To them, he was a living legend, the boy from Texas who had faced tanks alone. To him, he was just a soldier trying to sleep through the night. He had never planned to become a public figure, but history and Hollywood had other ideas. His fame reached California, where actor James Cagney read about him and invited him to Los Angeles. Murphy reluctantly accepted, not expecting much. Within a year, he was appearing in minor film roles, then major ones. By 1955, he starred as himself in To Hell and Back, a dramatization of his war memoir. The movie was a success. It became one of the highest-grossing war films of its time, but to Murphy, it felt hollow. "It never showed what it really felt like out there," he later said. "You can't put that kind of fear and confusion on a screen." Behind the cameras, Murphy was a man haunted by what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though the term did not exist yet. He suffered from chronic insomnia, often sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. Loud noises sent him back to the front lines in an instant. He avoided crowds, sudden movements, and long conversations about the war. When producers or journalists pressed him for details about Holzwehr, he would change the subject or walk away. "The real heroes," he once said, "are the ones who never came home." His candor was unusual for the time. In an era when most veterans were expected to simply move on, Murphy spoke openly about the invisible wounds of war. He lobbied for better mental health care for soldiers and warned about what he called the silent casualties, men who carried their battles inside them. "You don't leave a war behind," he told a journalist in 1960. "It follows you home, sits down beside you, and stays as long as it wants." Despite the shadows that followed him, Murphy remained a disciplined professional. He made more than 40 films, mostly westerns, and became known for his quiet, stoic screen presence, the same steadiness that had defined him in combat. He was courteous to his colleagues, punctual and private. Those who worked with him often sensed the distance he maintained between himself and the world around him. "He had a sadness you couldn't touch," one director later said, "like he was still waiting for something he'd left overseas." His fame made him a reluctant symbol of American courage, but among soldiers, both American and German, his name carried a different kind of respect. Veterans on both sides remembered the story of the man at Holzwehr. In post-war interviews, German officers described how rumors had spread among their units about a single American who stood against tanks. Some doubted the story at first. Others swore they had seen the smoke of the battle in the distance. Whether or not they witnessed it, the legend endured. For them, Murphy represented the terrifying unpredictability of their enemy, a man who would rather die than retreat. Among American veterans, his legend became something quieter but more enduring. They spoke of him as proof that one man's determination could shift the course of a battle. At reunions and military academies, instructors retold the story of the Ridge at Holzwehr, not as myth, but as a study in leadership under pressure. Cadets were taught that courage was not loud. It was the steady refusal to yield when every instinct said to run. Murphy's name became shorthand for that idea. Hold like Murphy, some instructors would say. If you can't move forward, then stand your ground. As the years passed, the weight of his fame grew heavier. Murphy's public life demanded a hero's calm, but privately, the war still haunted him. He struggled with sleeplessness, restlessness, and isolation. He once confided to a friend, "You live with ghosts. They don't fade with time. You just get used to seeing them." Fame brought him financial security, but not peace. He turned down roles that glorified violence and often donated money quietly to veterans' hospitals. He felt most at ease among former soldiers, men who understood without asking. In the 1960s, as a new generation of Americans faced another war in Vietnam, Murphy began speaking to younger soldiers about discipline and survival. He told them that bravery was not a feeling, but a decision, one made in seconds and lived with forever. He never romanticized war. "It doesn't make heroes," he said during one speech, "it makes survivors." His honesty resonated with those who had seen their own share of fear and confusion in combat zones far from home. Then, in May 1971, tragedy struck. While on a business trip, the private plane carrying Audie Murphy crashed into the side of a mountain in Virginia during bad weather. Everyone aboard was killed instantly. He was 45 years old. News of his death spread quickly. The nation that had once cheered his heroism now mourned his loss. President Richard Nixon ordered that he be buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The funeral was attended by soldiers, movie stars, and ordinary citizens who had followed his story since the war. The ceremony was simple, just as he would have wanted. A folded flag, a few words from an army chaplain, and a bugler's slow notes of taps echoing across the white rows of headstones. His grave soon became one of the most visited at Arlington. On his headstone, the inscription was plain: Audie L. Murphy, Texas, Medal of Honor. It was a small sentence for a life that had carried the weight of history. In the decades since, his name has never faded. Military academies still study his stand at Holzwehr as a model of small unit defense. His Medal of Honor citation is read aloud in leadership courses. Soldiers who never met him still refer to him as the Standard. To historians, he remains a symbol of endurance. To veterans, he is a brother in arms who spoke for the burden they all carried. But beyond the medals, the films, and the myth, what defined Audie Murphy most was his unyielding sense of duty, the quiet conviction that a man's responsibility does not end when fear begins. Those who fought beside him remembered that above all. "He didn't fight for glory," one of his men said years later. "He fought because someone had to stand there, and he decided it would be him." That is how history remembers him, not as the invincible hero Hollywood created, but as a soldier who faced the unimaginable and refused to fall back. The ridge at Holzwehr has long since been reclaimed by the forest. The snow melts each spring, the earth heals its scars, and silence returns. But the story endures, of a young man from Texas who turned a burning machine into a fortress and stood his ground against an army. For the generations that followed, his life became more than a tale of war. It became a measure of what resolve looks like when everything else has failed. And so, though the man is gone, the legend remains, not carved in marble or cast in bronze, but carried in the quiet creed of every soldier who has ever faced the impossible and whispered to himself, "Hold the line."